Chapter 1. A Garden Party. Interrupted. It was the sort of summer afternoon that seemed designed for peace. The garden at the Willoughby estate lay spread in perfect order beneath the warm June sun, its rose arches heavy with bloom, the lawn clipped to a green perfection that would have pleased any village committee. Lady Helena Willoughby had spared no expense on the fete. Tea was being poured into delicate porcelain cups. Cucumber sandwiches were replenished with clockwork precision, and a small string quartet under the cedar tree was attempting to make Haydn sound like background music. Miss Jane Marple, seated at a small wrought iron table near the edge of the lawn, was enjoying both the tea and the conversation, though more the latter in her own quiet way. She had just remarked to Mrs. Tilling that the vicar's new wife seemed to have the curious habit of glancing over her left shoulder before answering a question, when the sound came. It was small at first, a single high note, pure and oddly metallic, rising above the chatter and the music. Then it came again, longer, more urgent. It was not the quartet. It was a bird, perched high on the roofline of the house, a little green parrot whose cage had been set on the balcony to enjoy the air. The bird had a reputation in the village for mimicry. Children loved it, gardeners cursed it. Now it said, in a startlingly clear voice, "Jane Marple, Jane, murder." Conversations faltered. The bow of the first violin wavered. Miss Marple, for her part, looked up mildly, her eyes narrowing only a fraction. She did not believe in omens, not in the superstitious sense, but she did believe deeply in the unlikeliness of coincidence. It was Mrs. Willoughby herself who broke the moment's silence, laughing rather too loudly and declaring that Polly the parrot must have overheard some crime drama on the wireless. But the ripple of unease had already spread. Mr. Pargeter, the postmaster, began muttering about the uncanny nature of birds. Mrs. Tilling clutched Miss Marple's arm and whispered, "It's as if it knows something, Jane." The string quartet struck up again, and teacups clinked, but there was a strain in the air now, a slight brittleness under the sunshine. Miss Marple stirred her tea and glanced about, her eyes settling on the upstairs balcony from which the parrot had called. The French doors were ajar, a pale curtain lifting lazily in the breeze. 15 minutes later, when young Beatrice Lane, one of the housemaids, was sent upstairs to fetch more napkins, the scream that followed was unlike the bird's clear, mechanical mimicry. It was raw and human and cut through the fete like a blade. Guests surged to their feet. Lady Helena dropped her teacup, porcelain shattering on the flagstones. By the time anyone reached the balcony room, the parrot had gone silent. On the carpet just inside the French doors lay the body of Captain Lionel Graves, a retired army officer known in St. Mary Mead for his bracing manners and his daily walks with a silver-handled cane. His face was pale, his mouth slightly open, as though interrupted mid-sentence. It was Sergeant Fletcher who bent to check the man's pulse, then looked up grimly. "Dead," he said simply, "and I'd say not from natural causes." In the doorway, Miss Marple's hands were folded neatly before her. No one noticed how her eyes lingered not on the body, nor the parrot's empty cage, but on a single overturned teacup on the writing desk, its saucer clean, its rim unchipped, and the faintest ring of liquid staining the blotter beneath it. Chapter 2. The Village Reacts. The next morning dawned pale and damp, a thin mist curling along the hedgerows and softening the outlines of the cottages in St. Mary Mead. News of Captain Graves' sudden and suspicious death had moved through the village faster than the 8:10 post van, aided in no small part by those who had been at Lady Helena's fete and considered it their duty to set the record straight for anyone not fortunate enough to attend. By breakfast time, theories were already sprouting like dandelions. At the Blue Boar, Mr. Pargeter was overheard telling the butcher that Graves had been poisoned by some rare foreign venom brought back from his army days. The butcher, who had never much cared for Graves, nodded solemnly and added that it was probably done by a jealous husband, though whose husband he could not say. Over in the High Street, Mrs. Price Ridley, who prided herself on having her finger firmly on the village pulse, whispered to Mrs. Bantry that she had always suspected the captain was mixed up with certain ladies in ways unbecoming a man of his age. By 11s, it was generally agreed, with very little evidence, that the parrot's curious outburst had been a warning from beyond, though whether the beyond referred to the supernatural or simply the upstairs balcony was left vague. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was taking tea alone in her neat front parlour, her lace curtains drawn back just enough to see the comings and goings along the lane. She had already spoken briefly with Inspector Cray, who was in from Much Benham to oversee the investigation. A tall, spare man with an air of habitual impatience, Cray had listened politely to her suggestion that the overturned teacup on the writing desk might be of interest, then thanked her with a sort of professional blandness that meant he had filed it away under unimportant. Miss Marple was quite used to this response. As she sipped her tea, her mind turned to the late Captain Graves. She had known him only slightly, enough to exchange civil remarks when they passed on the lane, but she had watched him, as she did most people, with the unobtrusive curiosity that was as natural to her as breathing. He was a man who liked order, who valued his standing in the village, and who could, she suspected, be both charming and rather unpleasant depending on the audience. She remembered, too, the faintly triumphant look on Mrs. Bantry's face whenever she mentioned having had him to supper, and the cool politeness of Lady Helena whenever Graves' name came up in conversation. By mid-morning, the first of the villagers began to arrive at Miss Marple's garden gate, ostensibly to see how she was after yesterday's shock. Mrs. Tilling came first, bearing a plate of shortbread. She had barely crossed the threshold before leaning forward and whispering, "Mark my words, Jane, it's about money. There's always money at the bottom of these things." When Miss Marple gently suggested that not all crimes were motivated by greed, Mrs. Tilling conceded the point, but countered with a fresh theory involving Graves' rumoured gambling debts. Next came Mr. Hawthorne, the church organist, who claimed he had seen a stranger in the village the evening before, a tall man in a dark coat loitering near the post office. "Could have been anyone, I suppose," he admitted. But there was something about the way he stood there, like he was waiting for someone who never came. He seemed rather disappointed when Miss Marple did not leap to interpret this as a direct connection to the murder. The most interesting visit, however, came just after noon. Lady Helena herself arrived, impeccably dressed despite the somber circumstances, her manner a careful blend of dignity and distress. She thanked Miss Marple for attending the fete, then, lowering her voice, confided that Captain Graves had been staying at the Willoughby estate for the past week as a guest. He had business in the area, she explained, though he was not in the habit of explaining himself. A man of secrets, Jane, and not all of them. Harmless. Her eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary, as though to see whether Miss Marple might produce a secret of her own. After Lady Helena left, Miss Marple sat for a long while in her quiet parlour, her knitting idle in her lap. She could not help but reflect on the parrot's strange performance the day before. Birds, of course, were capable of mimicry, but they repeated what they heard often enough to fix in memory. And to call out a name, her own name, followed by the word murder. Well, that was a peculiarity not to be ignored. Whether it was mere chance or the result of someone's deliberate teaching remained to be seen. By late afternoon, the village seemed to hum with restless energy. People walked a little faster, glancing at one another with expressions that hovered between curiosity and suspicion. The Willoughby estate, once a place of open lawns and garden fete, now felt like a sealed house in a fever dream, the curtains drawn and the gate closed. The parrot, according to Beatrice Lane, had been moved to the kitchen, where it had said nothing since the discovery of the body. Inspector Cray was still on the grounds, questioning the staff and, it was rumoured, looking for a missing item from Graves' room. Miss Marple took a slow stroll to the high street in the early evening, stopping at the greengrocer's for a small basket of tomatoes. She listened as the shopkeeper and Mrs. Price Ridley discussed whether the killer might have been one of those tramps from the road. Miss Marple, her voice mild, remarked that tramps rarely attend garden parties, and that the matter might not be as straightforward as it appeared. Mrs. Price Ridley gave her a sharp look, but Miss Marple was already examining a head of lettuce with serene detachment. As she returned home along the lane, she passed Mr. Hawthorne again, this time in conversation with a young man she did not recognize, tall, with an air of easy charm, yet oddly watchful. They broke off when they saw her, and the stranger touched his hat in polite acknowledgment. Miss Marple inclined her head, her mind quietly storing away the details, the faint scent of tobacco smoke that clung to him, the scuffed leather of his shoes, and the way his gaze lingered a fraction too long on the windows of her cottage as she passed. When night fell, St. Mary Mead settled into an uneasy quiet. Behind closed curtains, conversations went on in low tones. In more than one house, locks were checked twice. Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting, her thoughts sifting gently through the day's fragments. There was an image she could not quite push aside, the overturned teacup on Captain Graves' desk, the liquid ring staining the blotter, and the curious fact that no one at the fete had recalled seeing him drink tea at all. Outside, in the cool stillness, a single sound carried faintly through the air, the rustle of leaves in the Willoughby garden, and then, just for a moment, the sharp, clipped call of the parrot. Not the words it had spoken before, but something new, short, almost a laugh, and then silence again. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Inspector Cray arrived at the Willoughby estate just after 8, his hat brim shining with a dew that had not yet burned off the lawn, and his manner set in the square lines of official purpose. He disliked village murders for the same reason he disliked village fates. There were too many witnesses and too many opinions, which did not cancel one another out so much as multiply into a fog. The house had been tidied overnight in that conscientious way of old establishments, as if the carpets themselves understood duty. Only the balcony room remained closed, its French doors latched and the thin curtain motionless. Cray paused at the threshold, glanced once at the writing desk, and directed Sergeant Fletcher to bring in the staff one by one. He preferred to hear people in the morning before the day's gossip had time to settle on their tongues like dust. Lady Helena sat with composed sorrow in the blue drawing-room, her hands folded against the soft thrust of her pearls, and answered questions with restrained civility. Captain Graves had come to stay, she said at his own request, explaining he had private business in the county, which a gentleman might reasonably conduct without announcing it to a crier. He had taken breakfast alone most days and an evening sherry in the library, where he studied the county almanac as if it were a novel. Cray asked whether Graves had enemies in St. Mary Mead, and Lady Helena allowed a polite, bitter smile, as one might allow a draught. "Enemies," she murmured, "is a word for melodramas, Inspector. In villages, we have old discomforts." She would not be drawn further, though her eyes sharpened when Cray mentioned the missing item, a small leather case that, according to Beatrice, usually lay on the captain's desk and was last seen the afternoon of the fete. Beatrice Lane entered with a kind of terrified obedience, her hands clenched in the apron folds as if the fabric anchored her to the floor. She had found the body, yes, and the parrot had been quiet then, not a sound beyond the tiny scrape of its claws on the perch. The leather case, she said, had a crack along one edge and a strap that would not buckle. She had dusted around it the day before and noticed a faint scent like old tobacco and something sharper, like furniture polish that went wrong. Cray asked if the captain had received callers, and Beatrice hesitated long enough to crease the mourning. She had seen, she admitted, Mr. Hawthorne, the organist, crossed the gravel at dusk 2 nights prior, and the captain himself had stepped out to the terrace and spoken with him in voices too low to carry. "Music," Beatrice whispered, but not the friendly kind. Miss Marple arrived without fanfare, in a pale summer hat that made her look like an ordinary bloom among the borders, and presented herself to Sergeant Fletcher with the courtesy one reserves for vicars and gatekeepers. Inspector Cray did not invite her to sit, but did not ask her to go either, which in Miss Marple's experience was as good as a welcome. She listened as he questioned the housemaid and the footman, and her gaze drifted, apparently idle, to the parrot's cage stationed now by the kitchen door. The bird preened its wing with grave deliberation, then produced, without warning, a small 2-note chirrup that was neither the Jane murder of yesterday nor the brittle laugh of the night. It was, Miss Marple thought, a summons one hears from a closed room. "Come here, someone is waiting." She asked, very softly, how long the bird had been in the household, and Beatrice said Lady Helena had inherited it from an eccentric aunt, along with a collection of painted fans that no longer opened. Inspector Cray made a round of the exterior, for which purpose he much preferred a policeman's boots to the best of brogues, and spent rather longer than necessary lingering beneath the balcony. The gravel there had been stirred and combed by last night's comings and goings, leaving not so much footprints as suggestions of them, like drawings a child rubs out and redraws until the paper grays. He noticed, however, a darker scatter beneath the balustrade, a dusting of something granular that had sifted into the grass edge, and he crouched to touch it with a finger. Sugar, perhaps, but fine as sand and fused in tiny clumps, as though damp had once met heat. Fletcher, when called, sniffed and shrugged. A fete meant sweets, and sweets meant sugar everywhere. Cray did not disagree, and did not forget it. Word reached Miss Marple, by the dependable route of Mrs. Tilling's errand for eggs, that Mr. Hawthorne had been seen early at the church, fumbling with the key, as though anxious that a door should open to him before its usual hour. A musician, Miss Marple reflected, lives by timing and habit, yet the mind that arranges notes may also arrange other things, and the two talents are not as distant as the innocent hope. She found Mr. Hawthorne at the organ bench, his fingers walking voicelessly along the keys, and apologized for intruding with such feminine inadequacy. "The captain admired your playing," she observed, and he flushed in that unattractive way of fair men, where the color rises all at once. Admiration had not been the tone, he admitted. The captain had opinions on tempo and on a hymn's proper spine, and on the sort of men who let lyricism carry them off like a gust. "I resent criticism less than contempt," Mr. Hawthorne said, and then, catching himself, smiled in a patchwork manner and asked after Miss Marple's roses. Inspector Cray, who did not consider roses relevant unless they concealed spades, took his statements with care from the rest. The footman who had glimpsed a young man at the gate, a stranger with polished hair and a city coat. The cook who disliked the captain's manner of tapping his glass to summon the decanter. The gardener who had found the back gate unlatched at dawn, which might mean a cat, or might mean everything people wished it to mean. Cray kept returning to the teacup on the desk and asked, more than once, who had carried tea upstairs that afternoon. Beatrice swore she had taken a tray to the library at 3 and to Lady Helena at 4, but never to the balcony room, and the housekeeper corroborated both times with the iron certainty of a woman who manages hours as other people manage coin. "Then whose cup," Cray said to the desk, "made that ring?" In the early afternoon, Miss Marple walked the path between the terrace and the kitchen garden, pausing to admire the gooseberries with the affectionate curiosity one reserves for naughty children. The parrot, visible through the open scullery window, tilted its head to watch her, and Miss Marple obligingly tilted hers in return, as if the two of them had agreed to meet in absurdity. "We are both very trying," she murmured, "when we repeat what we hear." The bird lifted one foot, balanced like a thoughtful clock, and produced then a new fragment, faint and careful, as if it tested each sound before allowing it to pass. Not yet. It might have been nothing, a ghost of a sound from some wireless play, but the phrase landed in Miss Marple's mind as lightly as thistledown and stayed where it fell. The stranger with the scuffed shoes, Miss Marple remembered shoes the way sailors remember winds, appeared again near the lane at 2:30, speaking to a boy with a bicycle and offering a coin that flashed like a fish. Miss Marple, who never believed in scaring off information, pretended difficulty with her parasol and allowed the man to step forward with a well-rehearsed gallantry. He introduced himself as Mr. Colin Vane, a traveller in photographic supplies, which would account for the neat leather satchel he carried and the faint chemical tang around him, bitter as almonds left in sunlight. He paid St. Mary Mead the compliment of surprise at its loveliness, and asked, with the most delicate indirection, whether one might find the Willoughby house that way or the other. Miss Marple, with gratitude for a clear map, sent him the long way round. Inspector Cray's interview with Lady Helena resumed at 3, and it moved by degrees from the polished surface to what lay beneath, like the slow passage of a hand through water. Lady Helena admitted at last that the captain had held a small obligation over the household, something he hinted at rather than declared, which is often the more effective method. There had been, she said, a family matter many years back involving her late husband, a fumbled investment and a letter best left unread. Graves had been part of a circle that knew more than it ought. He visited, she said, to remind me that the past is not a graveyard, but a garden, Inspector. Things continue to grow in it. Cray reflected that blackmail, like ivy, often flourishes on old stone, and he filed the thought with the others, not trusting any of them yet. As the day lengthened, so did the villagers' appetite for certainty, which is to say, its appetite for error. Mrs. Price Ridley declared the murderer must be foreign because foreigners do not understand our institutions. Mr. Pargeter decided it was the organist because musicians have sensitive tempers. The butcher revised his jealous husband theory to accommodate a jealous fiancé, and then, delighting in the flexibility of imagination, a jealous widow. Miss Marple visited the post office to buy a length of string she did not require, and listened while the postmistress, whose ears were large in all the ways that matter, mentioned a registered letter for the captain the previous week, bearing a London postmark and a return address, smudged to illegibility. He signed with a handsome flourish, she said, and slipped it into that leather case as if it were a rabbit hole and he meant to hide. Toward evening, Cray allowed himself back into the balcony room, not to interrogate the furniture, but to sit inside the scene and let it breathe at him. The desk faced the French doors as if the writer admired a view more than his work. The blotter still held the faint ring of the absent cup. The chair behind was set slightly askew, neither pushed in nor flung back, suggesting a man interrupted by someone he meant to indulge. On the carpet near the window, almost under the hem of the curtain, a tiny thread lay coiled like a question mark, the color not white but a pale powder blue that matched nothing in the room. Cray lifted it with a pen and smiled without pleasure, a motion of the mouth that could have meant progress or merely the practice of it. He dropped the thread into an envelope and wrote on the flap with a care that made each letter a small witness. Miss Marple ended her day with a slow circuit of her rose bed, admiring the more modest blooms as others admire masterpieces, and replaying each voice she had heard until the tones arranged themselves into a sort of score. People say more in silence than in speech, she knew. They say it with the looks they do not exchange, with the doors they close too gently, with the object they forget to mention until reminded. The parrots, not yet. The sugar that had half melted, the blue thread without a garment to belong to, the young man who sold photographic supplies in a village that preferred portraits taken 40 years ago. Each detail perched politely in her thoughts, not making a fuss and not asking to be solved. "There is an order to these things," she said to the roses. "But it does not begin where one expects." The bird, far off in the Willoughby kitchen, laughed once and was still, as if someone had put a finger to its beak. When the church bell marked the half-hour, the village settled into the tentative peace that follows a day of disturbance, a hush not of contentment but of drawing breath. Inspector Cray, at his desk in the inn, wrote 3 names he did not yet intend to show anyone and underlined none of them. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside with the exactness of a woman leaving a bookmark and stood at her window a moment longer than habit required, watching the last light fade from the lane. Tomorrow would bring the first proper statements and perhaps, if human nature remained obliging, a quarrel or 2. It is astonishing how swiftly the truth appears when people believe they are merely defending themselves, and somewhere, in the garden where a parrot had learned too much, a second secret waited its turn, prepared to make the day's neat arrangements shift by a hair's breadth. Just enough for someone to notice. Chapter 4. First Suspects. By the following morning, Inspector Cray had the first shape of his suspect list, though he would have called it a working outline rather than a verdict. 3 names had circled back to him in different voices. Mr. Hawthorne, the organist, for his odd meeting with Captain Graves and the edge in his tone whenever the man's name arose. Mr. Colin Vane, the so-called photographic supplier, whose presence in St. Mary Mead could not yet be accounted for by any legitimate order, and, more delicately, Lady Helena herself, whose composure sat too comfortably on the scaffold of old grievance. Cray was not yet ready to say any of them had the means or the opportunity, but the air about each was threaded with possibility. The village, meanwhile, had gone about its business with the alertness of people expecting to be stopped and questioned. Those who had spoken too freely the day before now moderated their accounts, paring away details that seemed suddenly rash. Mrs. Price Ridley, who had claimed to overhear raised voices in the garden during the fete, now decided it had probably been the quartet tuning their instruments. The butcher forgot entirely that he had seen a stranger near the hollow. Only Mrs. Tilling remained constant in her belief that the entire matter revolved around money, declaring over the tea counter that there's no surer weapon than a debt that won't be paid. Miss Marple, on her way to the post office, found herself overtaken by Mr. Vane. He fell into step beside her with the air of a man for whom companionship was as much an investigative tactic as courtesy. His questions about the Willoughby estate were framed as idle curiosity. Was the house as old as it looked? Did the gardens always win the county prize? And was it true, he asked, lowering his voice, that Lady Helena kept valuable silver in a locked display cabinet? Miss Marple, with a smile that might have belonged to any amiable spinster, replied that she had no knowledge of Lady Helena's housekeeping arrangements and suggested Mr. Vane might inquire of the gardener, who knows which key fits what, or so they say. She did not miss the brief flicker in his expression at the word key, as if some private tally had just been adjusted. At the Willoughby house, Inspector Cray conducted his first formal interview with Mr. Hawthorne. The organist arrived punctually, his dark suit brushed but faintly smelling of damp stone as though he had come straight from the church. Cray asked directly about the conversation he had with Captain Graves 2 nights before the murder. Hawthorne admitted to a difference of opinion, but claimed it was nothing more than an artistic quarrel. "The captain," he said, "considered my tempo on Rock of Ages too indulgent. I considered his manner too military for sacred music." He denied raising his voice, though Beatrice's recollection suggested otherwise. When Cray asked where he had been during the fete, Hawthorne claimed to have played the organ for the early service, taken luncheon alone at home, and arrived at the Willoughby estate in time to hear the quartet's second piece. There were no witnesses to confirm the first part of his afternoon. Miss Marple spent that same morning at Mrs. Bantry's under the pretense of exchanging patterns for a new tea cosy. Mrs. Bantry, whose memory was as selective as her gossip was wide, recalled seeing Captain Graves speaking to a woman by the rose arbor shortly before the parrot's outburst. She thought it might have been Mrs. Price Ridley, though the hat could also have belonged to a visitor from Much Benham. "It was a private sort of talk," she said, heads together, hands busy with nothing at all. "You know the kind." Miss Marple did know the kind. Two people not wishing to be overheard, yet not choosing to hide entirely. That, she thought, was a configuration worth tucking away. In the afternoon, Cray returned to the balcony room, this time with the intention of tracing the captain's last movements. The desk yielded little beyond the blotter and an inkwell with a lid slightly ajar, as though someone had lifted it in haste. In the waste-paper basket lay the torn half of an envelope, the handwriting on it bold and angular, the rest of the paper gone. Cray turned it over and found, just at the edge, the lower half of 2 letters, possibly part of a name, though which name was anyone's guess. He placed it with the pale blue thread in the same envelope, thinking again of the missing leather case. Miss Marple's walk that evening took her past the vicarage, where the vicar's young wife stood at the gate, her eyes scanning the lane as if in hope of someone's arrival. She greeted Miss Marple warmly, but with a trace of nervousness, and when asked whether she had attended the fete, said yes, though she had left early due to a touch of headache. Miss Marple remarked that the air had been rather close that day, and the vicar's wife agreed, adding, perhaps too quickly, that she had not spoken to Captain Graves beyond the usual pleasantries. Yet her glance slid away as she said it, and Miss Marple noted how her hands gripped the gatepost as if it might keep her steady. That night, the village's quiet was punctuated once more by the parrot. Beatrice, carrying linens to the airing cupboard, heard it murmur a single phrase. 2 words only, but clear enough to raise the hairs on her arms. Too late. Whether the bird meant it as repetition or prophecy, she could not tell. She told no one but the cook, who told the gardener, who, in his turn, muttered it to Mr. Pargeter at the Blue Boar. By the next morning, half the village had heard it in some form, each version a little altered, as if the bird's voice were travelling through a hall of mirrors. Inspector Cray, hearing the gossip, chose not to comment, but Miss Marple, when Mrs. Tilling repeated it over morning tea, only gave a small nod, as though another tile had been set in place. Words, she knew, had a way of coming back to their origins, and sooner or later they would point to the hand that had taught them. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The morning after the parrot's latest utterance dawned sharp and bright, as though the weather had decided to contradict the mood of the village. Sunlight lay across the green like an open book, but no one seemed inclined to read it. The hush that had settled on St. Mary Mead was different from the polite quiet of country life. It was the taut silence of people waiting for someone else to speak first. Even the postmistress, whose usual greetings were a match for any church bell in volume and regularity, offered only a subdued morning when Miss Marple entered to purchase a packet of note cards she did not need. At the counter, she listened as 2 women debated whether the parrot's "too late" had been a reference to the captain's final moments or an entirely coincidental echo of some long-forgotten tea-time quarrel. Miss Marple did not offer her view. Her mind was elsewhere, on the image of the vicar's young wife gripping the gatepost the previous evening, her voice a little too quick in denying any conversation with the dead man. Human truth, Miss Marple knew, was often like a dropped stitch, small enough to overlook, but if pulled, the whole pattern shifted. Inspector Cray, for his part, was finding the village's web of recollections a tangle rather than a net. He had spoken again to Mr. Vane, whose claim to be a travelling supplier of photographic goods was, on the face of it, legitimate enough. A box of photographic plates and developing fluid in the man's possession confirmed the trade. Yet Cray could not ignore the fact that the leather satchel was large enough to carry the missing case from Graves's room, or that the chemical tang on the contents was not unlike the almond note Beatrice had detected. When Cray asked directly whether Vane had known the captain before arriving in the village, the man's smile was the sort that suggested a question misunderstood on purpose. Miss Marple paid a morning call to Lady Helena, who received her in the small morning room, a space lined with pale green wallpaper patterned in ivy leaves. The windows were open to the garden, where the parrot sat in its cage, head tilted, observing the conversation as if taking mental notes. Lady Helena's composure had softened into something more brittle, and in that shift Miss Marple saw a readiness to talk that had not been there before. They discussed roses, the progress of the gardener's work, and finally the captain. Lady Helena admitted he had, in recent days, become preoccupied with a particular letter, which he kept close and consulted more than once. "It was as if," she said, "he was considering whether to act upon it or burn it, and I could not say which he preferred." She did not know the letter's origin, though Miss Marple thought of the torn envelope in Cray's possession and the bold handwriting on its edge. In the course of their talk, Miss Marple's attention was caught by a small tray on a side table. It held a cluster of silver teaspoons, polished to a shine, and among them one that did not match. Its handle was plainer, its bowl slightly deeper, and the faintest shadow of tarnish clung to the inner curve. When Miss Marple lifted it for a closer look, Lady Helena remarked absently that it had been brought up from the kitchen after the fete, and no one seemed to recall to which set it belonged. Miss Marple replaced it gently, the thought forming in her mind that mismatched objects were often the most revealing. Inspector Cray's inquiries that afternoon took him to the church, where he found Mr. Hawthorne adjusting the stops on the organ. The man seemed less defensive than before, though his manner retained the faint tension of someone wary of being misunderstood. Cray mentioned the letter found in Graves' room, and Hawthorne's eyes flickered, only briefly, but enough for a careful observer to note. He claimed no knowledge of it and said he had been practicing for Sunday's service during the crucial half-hour before the scream. No one had heard him play. "Music," he said with a dry twist of his mouth, "is often solitary." Cray wondered if he meant music or guilt. Miss Marple, later that day, walked the length of the lane toward the vicarage. She found the vicar's wife in the garden, pruning lavender with a little too much energy. They spoke of small things, the weather, the strain of settling into a new parish, until Miss Marple mentioned, almost in passing, the captain's fondness for conversation. The young woman's hand hesitated on the shears. She said she had indeed spoken to Graves briefly at the fete, though it had been about nothing more serious than the arrangement of tables for the raffle. Yet her eyes betrayed the quick, inward calculation of someone deciding which truths could be told. Miss Marple smiled kindly, as if the matter were of no great import, and let the moment pass. That evening, the gardener at the Willoughby estate, returning late from the far edge of the grounds, claimed to have seen a figure slip out through the side gate. It was, he told the cook, too dark to see a face, but the outline was slight, the stride quick. The cook repeated this to Beatrice, who told the footman, who by breakfast had told half the village. Inspector Cray, hearing the account, asked which night this had been. The gardener was certain. It was the night before the fete. That in itself was not suspicious, but Cray could not ignore that it was also the night Mr. Hawthorne had met with Graves in low voices on the terrace. Miss Marple, as the village whispered itself to sleep, sat in her parlour and reviewed her mental picture of the balcony room. She remembered the light in the space, how it fell more directly on the writing desk than on the tea table, and how the blotter's ring was positioned at an angle, as though the cup had been set down with the left hand. Graves, she recalled, had been right-handed. A small thing, perhaps, but human habits were rarely reversed without cause. The mismatched spoon, the parrot's shifting vocabulary, the stranger with the satchel. All these formed loose threads, but she could feel them beginning to draw together. In the stillness of the night, as if in confirmation, the parrot gave a single, sharp cry. It was not a word this time, but the sound of liquid being poured, a perfect mimicry, so real that for an instant Miss Marple could almost smell the faint sweetness of tea. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. By the following afternoon, the air in St. Mary Mead seemed to hum with unspoken accusations. It was not the outward chaos of a city crime, but the more refined turbulence of a village where every person believed they knew exactly where guilt should rest, only, inconveniently, no two opinions aligned. In the high street, conversations paused when a figure passed, eyes following with the discreet persistence of lace curtains shifting in an upstairs window. People were civil, but the civility had the brittle edge of china that had been cracked and glued. Inspector Cray sensed it too. His questions were beginning to stir a sediment of old grievances, and the clearer the water became, the more unpleasant the shapes revealed beneath it. That morning, he summoned Lady Helena and Mr. Vane to the drawing-room at the same time, a calculated choice, for he wished to watch them in one another's company. The exchange was polite enough on the surface, but there was a flicker of something harder each time their eyes met, a recognition neither cared to explain. When Cray asked whether they had spoken before the fete, Lady Helena said no without hesitation. Vane's reply was the same, but slower, as if each syllable were measured. Miss Marple, sitting at her knitting in the corner, appeared absorbed in counting stitches. Yet her ear caught the subtle discord. People telling the truth often answered with the same speed, she thought. People who were lying tended to listen to the sound of their own words before committing them to the air. She stored the difference away, not pressing it now. Outside the Willoughby estate, the day carried its own small dramas. Mrs. Price Ridley and Mrs. Bantry were seen in heated discussion near the churchyard, their voices carrying just enough for passers-by to catch the phrase, "that woman," more than once. Later, Mrs. Price Ridley declared to anyone who would listen that Mrs. Mrs. Bantry had been seen walking away from the rose arbor moments before the parrot's first cry. Mrs. Bantry, affronted, claimed she had been nowhere near it, and furthermore that Mrs. Price Ridley's hat was so wide it could have been mistaken for 3 people standing together. These were not accusations that concerned Cray directly, but Miss Marple paid them quiet attention. Even petty quarrels could brush against the edge of the truth. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the vicarage under the pretext of delivering a jar of damson jam. The vicar's young wife received her with nervous warmth, glancing once or twice over her shoulder toward the study where her husband worked. After a few pleasantries, Miss Marple mentioned she had heard of a figure seen leaving the Willoughby side gate the night before the fete. The young woman's hand tightened around the jar. She said she had no knowledge of such a thing, yet the denial was too quick, as though rehearsed. Miss Marple, with the lightest smile, asked whether she had known Captain Graves long. The young wife hesitated, then admitted they had met once before her marriage, when she had been visiting Much Benham. It was nothing, she said, but the color in her cheeks deepened as she spoke. Back at the estate, Cray turned his attention to Beatrice. She had been faithful in her duties, but her account of the hours before the murder contained a small discrepancy. The day before, she had claimed not to have brought tea to the balcony room. Now, pressed again, she said she might have left a tray there briefly when looking for Lady Helena. Cray asked whether Captain Graves had been in the room at the time. Beatrice bit her lip, then said she thought she had heard voices from the balcony, one of them not belonging to Lady Helena. She could not, or would not, say whose it was. The parrot, meanwhile, had taken to bouts of silence broken by sudden, startling fragments of speech. In the early evening, as Miss Marple left the estate by the garden path, she heard it murmur something that made her pause. "Put it down." The tone was clipped, commanding, as if imitating someone accustomed to being obeyed. She stood for a moment, considering the words, then continued on without comment. That night, the Blue Boar was busier than usual. Mr. Hawthorne was seen in conversation with Mr. Vane, their heads bent close, though the two had previously given the impression of being strangers. Mrs. Tilling, passing by, swore she caught the word photograph in their exchange. By morning, she had told Mrs. Bantry, who had told the butcher, who repeated it at the post office until the entire village was wondering what photograph could possibly tie an organist and a traveling salesman together. Inspector Cray did not dismiss the rumor. Early the next day he questioned Vane again, this time about his movements on the day of the fete. Vane maintained that he had arrived in the village mid-morning, spoken briefly to the gardener about a possible photograph of the Willoughby grounds, and attended the fete as a casual visitor. Cray asked if he had taken any photographs. Vane said no, but the denial once again came a heartbeat too late. Miss Marple, walking back from the grocer's, stopped at the church to speak to Mr. Hawthorne. She asked after the Sunday service and whether he would be playing Rock of Ages at the vicar's request. He gave a faint, self-conscious smile and said he thought not. "Some pieces," he remarked, "carry too much association." Miss Marple nodded as though in agreement, but in her mind, the remark slotted neatly beside the memory of Beatrice hearing music, but not the friendly kind, 2 nights before the murder. By evening, the undercurrent in St. Mary Mead had thickened. People were no longer simply speculating. They were choosing sides. Some favored the theory of a stranger's crime, pinning their suspicions on Vane. Others were certain it was someone within the village, a person who had smiled at them across the fete's tea tables. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour, knitting a row, then pausing to glance at the notebook in which she had jotted a list, not of suspects, but of moments. A mismatched spoon, a left-handed cup ring, a command repeated by a parrot, and somewhere among them a truth that was slowly taking shape. Outside, the evening air carried the faint scent of roses from the Willoughby garden. Somewhere within the house, the parrot gave a low, throaty chuckle, as if amused by the way humans circled their secrets, never quite daring to speak them aloud. Chapter 7. Another Twist. The next morning broke in a pale wash of light, the kind that lent every shadow a hesitant edge, as though the day itself were reluctant to show its hand. St. Mary Mead stirred to its customary rhythm. Bakers stacking loaves in their windows, postmen wheeling along familiar routes, but beneath the surface, the village held its breath. Captain Graves's murder had been the only topic worth speaking of for days, but now a new ripple ran through the conversations. Something had happened at the Willoughby estate again. Miss Marple heard the first version from Mrs. Tilling at the greengrocer's, spoken in the hushed urgency of one who wants to be overheard. Beatrice Lane, the housemaid, had been found in the scullery early that morning, sitting on a stool with her apron half off and her face the colour of unbaked bread. She would say little of what had frightened her, only that she had gone into the larder and heard someone moving in the pantry when no one was meant to be there. By the time she gathered the courage to look, the space was empty, except for a folded scrap of paper lying beside the flour bin. Inspector Cray was on the scene before the rumour had made its second lap around the high street. The scrap of paper, now in his possession, bore only 2 words in an unsteady hand. Not yet. It was enough to make him think of the parrot, though he had no patience for coincidences. He questioned Beatrice carefully, but her answers remained vague. She could not say whether the sound in the pantry was of a man or woman, nor whether the folded paper had been there before she arrived. Cray left with the uncomfortable sense that she was holding something back. Whether out of fear or loyalty, he could not tell. Miss Marple, when told of the note, felt the faint tightening of a thread already in her mind. She had heard the phrase before, spoken in the parrot's careful mimicry, on a sunny afternoon in the garden. Words, once learned, had to come from somewhere. A bird did not conjure them out of air. She took a walk past the Willoughby grounds, pausing to greet the gardener. In their brief exchange, she asked, almost idly, whether Mr. Vane had been to the estate since the fete. The gardener said yes. He had seen the man the previous day, near the greenhouse, looking for a vantage point to photograph the old cedar. Miss Marple made a soft noise of interest, but asked nothing more. Inside the house, Cray pressed Lady Helena on the matter of the note. She insisted she had never seen the handwriting before, though she was visibly unsettled by the message. "It's as if someone is playing with us," she said, her composure thinner than it had been in any previous interview. "As if we are being told to wait for something worse." Cray agreed, though privately he wondered if the note was meant for her specifically, and whether she understood more of its meaning than she admitted. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. The young wife answered the door, her expression caught between welcome and wariness. They spoke in the parlour over tea, and Miss Marple observed how the woman's hands trembled slightly as she poured. In the course of their conversation, Miss Marple mentioned the new incident at the Willoughby estate. The young wife's eyes flickered quickly away, her teacup rattling faintly against its saucer. "It's terrible," she said, "but I suppose one must expect disturbances after something so dreadful." The pause before disturbances did not escape Miss Marple's notice. In the early evening, a new detail emerged, not from the house, but from the Blue Boar. The innkeeper, a broad man with the habit of remembering things in precise slices of time, told Cray that Mr. Hawthorne and Mr. Vane had been in his establishment the night before, and that their conversation, though quiet, had grown abruptly tense. The word case had been used, not in the legal sense, the innkeeper was certain, but as in a case to be opened or kept shut. Cray asked whether either man had carried anything with them. The innkeeper hesitated, then recalled that Vane's satchel had been on the bench beside him the entire time. By nightfall, the villagers' talk had turned from who killed Captain Graves to what might happen next. People speculated on the note's meaning, some insisting it was a threat, others calling it the work of a practical joker. Miss Marple listened to all of it without comment. She was not thinking about the note in isolation, but in relation to the left-handed teacup ring, the mismatched spoon, and the bird's peculiar vocabulary. These were not stray details. They were edges of the same puzzle. Before retiring, she stepped into a small garden to take in the night air. From somewhere across the stillness came the faintest sound. The parrot again, its voice clipped and urgent. This time it said only one thing, in a tone unlike any it had used before. "Put it down. Now." The words hung in the air like a dropped stitch, waiting to unravel the whole garment. Miss Marple stood very still, listening to the silence that followed. Somewhere close by, she thought. Someone else had heard it too. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final test begins. The morning after the parrot's urgent, "Put it down, now," found St. Mary Mead dressed in a veil of soft mist. The lane outside Miss Marple's cottage lay quiet, the hedgerows beading with damp, the air holding the faint smell of turned earth. It was the sort of day when sound travelled oddly. Carriage wheels from the main road seemed close enough to touch, and the call of a milkman echoed long after he had gone. Miss Marple sat at her small breakfast table, not reading her Post, but staring at the steam rising from her teacup. She had decided that the time for passive listening was nearly over. The trouble with a village murder, she reflected, was that it encouraged too much talking and not enough revealing. The trick was to make someone reveal without knowing they had done so. Inspector Cray arrived mid-morning, his coat damp at the shoulders, his manner clipped. He had brought the note found in the pantry, folded and refolded into a sharp square. "Handwriting's no match to anything local," he said, setting it on her table. "London style, if you ask me. Trained but hurried." Miss Marple studied it for a moment, then asked whether he had shown it to Lady Helena. Cray frowned. She says she's never seen it before. I believe her, but she's holding something back. They all are. Miss Marple smiled faintly at the use of all. In her experience, all was rarely an exaggeration. She suggested to Cray, in her mildest tone, that sometimes a question is best answered when it is not put directly. He gave her a glance that was half doubt, half reluctant respect. If you've got a way to make them talk, Miss Marple, I'll hear it. But no tricks that could be called interference. She nodded, knowing perfectly well that her kind of interference never looked like interference at all. Her first stop was the church. Mr. Hawthorne was there, running his fingers over the organ keys without producing a sound, as though listening to music in his head. Miss Marple approached with a look of innocent inquiry and spoke of the hymn list for Sunday. In the course of their conversation, she mentioned the fete and the captain lightly, as though recalling a harmless afternoon. Then, as if by chance, she asked whether Hawthorne had ever kept a bird. His answer came too quickly. No, I haven't the patience. And his eyes slid away before returning to hers. She noted it without pressing. Sometimes the significance of a denial lay not in the denial itself, but in the decision to make one. From the church, she went to the Willoughby estate. Lady Helena received her in the morning room again, the parrot present in its cage, preening and occasionally ruffling its feathers. Miss Marple admired the bird, commenting on its cleverness in remembering words. Lady Helena smiled, though her fingers twisted the edge of her handkerchief. It does like to repeat things, she said. Sometimes things it shouldn't. Miss Marple let her own eyes wander to the silver tray on the side table, where the mismatched spoon still lay among its more elegant companions. She lifted it lightly, admiring the curve of the handle, and remarked how unusual it was. Lady Helena hesitated, then said it must have been mixed in from another set long ago. It was the sort of explanation people gave when they didn't wish to be asked a second question. Miss Marple's next call was at the Blue Boar, ostensibly to inquire after a jar of pickled walnuts she had heard the innkeeper stocked. The place was quiet, with only Mr. Vane seated at the far end, a newspaper folded on the table before him. She asked if she might join him, and he agreed with easy politeness. In the course of their small talk, she spoke of photography, how it must be useful to capture a scene exactly as it was, before memory blurred the details. Of course, she added, some scenes are worth capturing only for the evidence they hold. Vane's eyes narrowed, but his mouth smiled. Evidence, Miss Marple. I'm not sure photographs are as incriminating as people think. She agreed, adding, unless, of course, they catch something one meant to keep hidden. His smile held, but she saw the faint pulse jump in his temple. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple had laid the groundwork for what she privately called her final test. It would be simple in form, a gathering, casual in appearance, at which each of the key figures would be present. The purpose was not to question them, but to allow them to react, naturally, she hoped, to a small and seemingly innocent provocation. She had learned long ago that the guilty reveal themselves less in their answers than in the moments they believe no one is watching. The opportunity came sooner than expected. That evening, Lady Helena invited a small group to take tea in the garden, to put the unpleasantness behind us, as she put it. The guests included Mr. Hawthorne, Mr. Vane, the vicar's young wife, and Miss Marple herself. The parrot was brought out onto the balcony in its cage, its bright eyes darting from face to face. Tea was poured. Conversation drifted to the weather, the state of the roses, the ongoing police presence. Miss Marple, seated so she could watch all of them without turning her head, waited for the moment. It came when the parrot, without prompting, spoke in its clipped, uncanny voice. Not yet. Put it down. The words dropped into the gathering like a stone into still water. Lady Helena's hand froze on the teapot. Mr. Hawthorne's eyes flicked, almost involuntarily, toward Vane. The vicar's wife looked down into her lap, her knuckles whitening around her cup. And Vane smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile, the kind that knew it had bane seen. Miss Marple made no comment, only continued stirring her tea. But in her mind, the pattern had begun to knit itself together with the quiet inevitability of something that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. She had not yet solved it, not fully, but she had narrowed the field. And she knew that the next move would have to come from the person who most feared the parrot's voice being heard again. That night, as the guests departed and the garden grew still, Miss Marple lingered by the gate. In the distance, she could just make out the faint, measured footsteps of someone walking quickly away along the lane. Not the heavy tread of Inspector Cray, nor the brisk clip of Lady Helena's stride. This was lighter, but purposeful. She stood very still, listening until the sound faded, and then turned back toward her cottage. The test had begun. Now she only needed to wait for the guilty to make the smallest of mistakes. Chapter 9. The trap tightens. The morning after the garden tea had a different flavor to it, as though the whole village were quietly leaning in. It wasn't only the murder now. It was the sense that something was close to breaking. Even the air felt alert, the mist lifting faster than usual, sunlight slipping through in sharp blades. At the post office, people's voices were low, and their eyes darted to the door each time it opened, as if expecting someone to arrive with news. Miss Marple, collecting a small packet of sewing thread she had no urgent need for, sensed the undercurrent. The guilty, she knew, had a way of betraying themselves, not just by what they said, but by how they occupied space in days that edged toward revelation. Inspector Cray came to her cottage mid-morning, the set of his jaw telling her more than his words. He had spoken again with Lady Helena, Hawthorne, and Vane, separately, but each seemed more careful than before, their answers clipped at the edges. "They're wary now," he said, "watching me as much as I watch them." Miss Marple nodded. She'd seen it at the tea. "It's often when people are most guarded," she said gently, "that they leave the door ajar." Cray eyed her as if she'd offered a puzzle without the picture on the box. She did not elaborate. She had spent the night turning over the moment when the parrot had spoken, those few seconds of frozen movement, averted gazes, and a single wrong smile. The reactions had told her more than any confession could have, but they needed confirmation. A test could narrow suspicion to certainty, and certainty, in her quiet way, was what she was after. By early afternoon, she had put the beginnings of that test in motion. A chance remark made to Mrs. Price Ridley while buying tomatoes about how the police might be closing in was all it took to start the village machinery turning. Within an hour, the news was reshaped and magnified. Inspector Cray had found the missing leather case, and it contained something damning. Miss Marple knew it would reach the right ears. Gossip in St. Mary Mead was less a current and more a system of pipes. She only had to turn the tap. She spent the rest of the afternoon on seemingly harmless visits. At the vicarage, the young wife greeted her with the same guarded smile she had worn at tea, though her voice was brighter than before. They spoke of church flowers and the dampness affecting the roses. Miss Marple mentioned, in passing, that she had heard a curious thing, that someone had been seen at the Willoughby estate late last night, lingering near the kitchen window. The young wife's eyes widened just enough to betray that she had not expected to hear it. She made a small, swift movement with her hands, as though folding something invisible into herself, and then changed the subject. At the Blue Boar, Miss Marple found Mr. Vane alone at a table near the window, a half-empty cup before him. She remarked on the improvement in the weather, then on the difficulties of travel when police inquiries kept one in place. "It must be frustrating," she said, "not to be able to move on to your next town." Vane smiled, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. "I'll manage," he said. "I'm not in any hurry." The words were steady enough, but Miss Marple heard the faint note beneath, a man deciding whether he was being warned or tested. Back at the Willoughby estate, Inspector Cray had his own moment of unease. The parrot, which had been relatively quiet all morning, suddenly began repeating the phrase, too late, in a tone almost plaintive. Beatrice, passing by with a tray, muttered that she hated the sound of it. Cray stood listening for a moment longer than necessary. If a bird could unsettle the nerves of the living, he thought, what might it do to the guilty? Miss Marple arrived not long after, her manner as mild as ever. She asked after the parrot, admiring its plumage, and mentioned, quite offhand, that someone had told her the police were considering locking the bird in the pantry at night so as not to disturb the household. That would be a shame, she said softly. It might forget all sorts of things. Lady Helena, who had been pouring tea, paused mid-motion. Hawthorne, seated near the window, set down his cup without drinking. And Vane's eyes flicked briefly toward the cage before he reached for his napkin with an unnecessary flourish. The smallest signs, Miss Marple knew, could be the most telling. The rest of the tea passed in outward civility, but the air felt taut, as though invisible threads were being drawn tighter. Miss Marple said little, letting the silences do the work for her. When she finally rose to leave, she did so with the unhurried grace of a woman for whom time was an ally. Outside, she met Cray at the gate and told him, in her most ordinary tone, that it might be useful to keep the rumor about the leather case alive for another day. If one's patient, she added, people will show you which part of the house they don't want you to look into. That night, the village lay under a pale moon, the hedgerows sharp against the silvered fields. Somewhere near the Willoughby garden, a shadow moved, light, deliberate, carrying the faintest glint of metal. And from an upstairs window, unseen, Miss Marple watched the shape pause, glance toward the balcony, and then vanish into the dark. She did not move to stop it. The trap, after all, was not in the catching but in the coming back. Chapter 10. The Reveal. By dawn, the next day, the village was already alive with whispers. The Willoughby estate had been disturbed in the night, again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The gardener, making his early round, had found the side gates swinging open and the balcony doors unlatched. Inside the balcony room, nothing appeared to be missing, except the parrot. The cage sat on the desk, the door neatly fastened back. Inspector Cray arrived within the hour, his face tight with irritation. Whoever had taken the bird had done so quietly, deliberately, leaving no obvious trace. But Miss Marple, standing at the desk, looked down at the blotter with calm attention. The ring from the teacup still showed faintly, but beside it lay a new smudge, a crescent of fine white powder, just enough to catch the light. She touched it delicately, then dusted her fingers together. "Sugar," she murmured. "Birds don't take sugar, Inspector." By mid-morning, the parrot was found, alive, inside the church vestry, perched on the top shelf of the linen cupboard. Mr. Hawthorne, summoned from the organ loft, claimed ignorance, though the bird gave a small clipped call as soon as he entered. "Put it down, now." Cray's eyes flicked to him, but Miss Marple was watching someone else. Mr. Vane, who had arrived on the pretext of photographing the church, his expression tightened for the briefest moment, the kind of flicker that came when a man's careful work was about to unravel. That afternoon, at her cottage, Miss Marple requested that Inspector Cray gather the principal figures, Lady Helena, Hawthorne, Vane, and the vicar's wife, at the Willoughby drawing-room. She would, she said, explain matters in a way that might save him several more days of fruitless interviews. They assembled just as the afternoon light was fading. Miss Marple sat at the center, her hands folded on her lap. "It began," she said gently, "with the parrot's voice. Not its words, but its accuracy. It imitated not only tone but command, and what it said told us much about who had been near it. Put it down." Now is not the sort of phrase one shouts at a fate, but rather in a moment of urgency, perhaps instructing someone to set aside a certain item. Her eyes moved to Vane. The item in question was the captain's leather case. You see, the captain had received a letter, posted from London, containing something very awkward for Mr. Vane. A photograph. The captain knew its value. So did Mr. Vane. He came here under the guise of a travelling supplier to retrieve it, but the captain was not a man to give up such leverage. Vane's smile was fixed, but the colour in his face had drained a shade. Miss Marple continued, her tone as mild as if she were describing a knitting pattern. On the day of the fete, you saw your opportunity. The teacup ring on the desk was left by you, Mr. Vane. Set down with your left hand, for your right held the case. You slipped something into the captain's drink, likely from your photographic chemicals, which carry a smell of bitter almonds. Quick, quiet, and most unpleasant. Lady Helena made a small sound, but Miss Marple went on. You might have escaped notice, but the parrot heard you. It repeated your instruction, put it down, in front of all of us, and you realized it might say more. That is why you returned at night to steal it, first leaving the note in the pantry to suggest some other danger was at hand. You even placed the bird in the vestry, hoping suspicion might drift toward Mr. Hawthorne, whose late-night movements were already a matter of gossip. Vane's chair scraped faintly on the carpet. This is nonsense, he said evenly. A bird's chatter and a few old wives' tales. Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but her voice was firm. No, Mr. Vane. The parrot, the spoon, the sugar, all point to the same thing. The spoon on the tray was deeper than the others, made for measuring, not stirring. It had been used to add sugar to the tea, too much sugar, enough to disguise a bitter taste. You thought it clever, but small things, you see, are never so easily hidden. Inspector Cray stepped forward, his gaze hardening. We've already examined your satchel, Vane. The chemicals in your vials match residue from the blotter, and the photograph, we found it, tucked into the lining of your bag. Vane's smile collapsed. His eyes flicked once toward the door, then back to Miss Marple, as if recognizing, too late, the net she had drawn around him. It was never meant to, he began, but Cray's voice cut him off. Save it. You can tell the rest at Much Benham Station. When it was over and the others had gone, Cray lingered by the window. You had him marked from the start, didn't you? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, Inspector. I had everyone marked. The difference is that Mr. Vane's silences were always heavier than his words, and in the end, it wasn't the parrot that trapped him. It was the knowledge that it might speak again. Guilt fears an echo more than it fears an accusation. Outside, the last of the daylight drained from the Willoughby garden. The parrot, back in its cage, gave a soft, contented trill, as if the air itself had been cleared. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her skirt, and took her leave. Murder, she thought, was never pleasant, but human nature, its frailty, its vanity, its endless capacity for concealment, was as constant as the turning of the seasons. And there was always, in the end, someone willing to listen for what others tried so hard not to hear.